Techno CLIL for EVO 2017. This webinar is part of this initiative, Techno CLIL for EVO 2017. We are particularly grateful to Professor Carmel Coonan. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation, especially on a Saturday and a weekend. So thank you very much. We know how busy you are, so really thank you for finding time to cooperate with us. So Professor Carmel Coonan is a full professor at Foscari University in Venice. Her field of specialization is foreign second language teaching and learning, with particular reference to emerging teaching methodologies such as CLIL and EMI. And new target groups, infant primary school children, psychological aspects of foreign second language learning, plurilingual education, and issues in foreign language teacher training. She has conducted and participated in several research projects, both nationally and internationally in Europe, especially in the field of foreign language and medium instruction, CLIL. So Carmel is world famous. She was one of the first to bring CLIL to Italy, so we are so honored and privileged to have Professor Carmel Coonan here with us today. Thank you, Carmel, and the floor is yours.
It's a pleasure. Okay, fine. Thank you so much, Letizia, for your introduction. And it's a great pleasure to be able to speak to you today. I hope you can all hear me quite clearly. I'm in Venice at the moment. The snow that we had yesterday is still around, and it was very beautiful, but also quite annoying to walk through when it becomes sludge. But anyway, let's get to the subject of CLIL. I was asked to participate in this webinar and to choose a topic that I think might be of interest to those of you who are following this webinar. And I decided to go into the methodological aspects of CLIL, because that indeed does seem to represent the major problems, because it's when you actually put CLIL into practice that this is where everything has to click into place, and it is not easy. So the idea today is to give you some ideas about the principles and the issues hiding behind the doors of CLIL. Okay, so the title that I've given to my presentation, which sounds rather complicated and big, but indeed it isn't. It is the impact of CLIL on the teaching and learning of a non-language subject. Okay, so I'll begin my talk with you on this subject. Now then, the aim, I'm going to break it down, is to explore the CLIL issue, because of course CLIL is just so wide. I mean, you've already had two talks by David Marsh and Gisèle Allanger, who will have dealt with other aspects of CLIL. CLIL, indeed, being a teaching and learning environment, being part of language education policies, can be looked at from very, very many different viewpoints. And I said today the viewpoint I'm taking is methodology, but principally I'm going to look at issues from the language point of view. Okay, so that means to say that I'll be delving into aspects connected with comprehension. I'll be delving into aspects connected with production, language production, and also, to finish off, I'll be talking about issues concerning the setting of objectives. These are just three parts, three aspects, but in the time available, I can't do more, okay? So I hope what little I can give you might be a help for you to get get into doing delivering CLIL programs. Okay, now then, the acronym, you actually do need to know what the acronym means. It's Content and Language Integrated Learning, okay? Now, it was coined by David Marsh and his colleagues with reference to situations of foreign languages, foreign language medium instruction. Whereas previous to that, in the decades previous to the 90s, what was the object of reflection and discussion was second language medium instruction. The novelty was when in the 90s, with the support of the Council of Europe's work and the support of the European Commission's work, steps began to be taken to introduce foreign language medium instruction, but not in elite schools, in mainstream school systems. And Italy participated in this development as well. But first of all, I would like you to ask yourself or to think about this. How is the CLIL environment different from the one where the mother tongue is used as a medium for teaching and for learning? Because indeed, even in the normal school language, the students are learning through the language. But there is, to be recognized, there will be differences, and we'll look at them in a minute, but what happens when you use a language as a tool to learn, which is exactly what is being done with the foreign language. The foreign language is being used as a tool for learning. Indeed, there is a very deep link between language and learning. So much so that Halliday in the 1970s, actually Halliday is a linguist, actually proposed a language-based theory of learning. And through a series of research reflections, he identified the situation whereby through acts of meaning you develop your language system. And he saw this as a dialectic process. You try to mean something, you make meaning, you try to get to grips with the world, with learning about the world, learning objects. Little children do this in their mother tongue. They don't wait until they've acquired the system. They begin to communicate using the little that they have. And as they communicate and try to express themselves, they actually begin to construct the language system through making meaning. So by interacting with people, by pointing, by naming, by referring, by asking, they are building up their language system. This is the dialectic process between system and acts of meaning. So it's a very, very important process, and it's through acts of meaning that children develop their language system. Indeed, also, Vygotsky spoke of the same thing. He also saw this deep link between language development and learning. And he called language a powerful symbolic instrument for learning. It's not an instrument, it is an instrument for thought, because thought is crystallized when it's verbalized. Your thought becomes something real if it's put into words. And he also made the point that language is not only merely used to communicate meanings which already exist, but it is also the means whereby meanings are created. And you can see how important these reflections are by Halliday and by Vygotsky. And here I found some quotes by Swain. Merrill Swain is a linguist as well in the field of second language acquisition, and much of her work is inspired by the work of Vygotsky. These are some of the things that she has. I've taken from one of her articles. Indeed, thought is not merely expressed in words; it comes into existence through them. Thought finds reality and form in language. Now, here we're talking about language in general. Okay, if you think about what your students are doing when they're learning through the normal school language, then they are being helped to do exactly this. Let's go to the next quote. Speaking and writing complete and transform thought. Here we see just how important it is in the learning process to speak and to write. It's not only just understanding the comprehension, but it's speaking and writing as well. We will see that there are implications for this in the CLIL environment. And when you speak and when you write, what happens is a phenomenon called coming to know while speaking, or it could be said, coming to know while writing. In other words, as soon as you speak about something, you become aware of how well you know that thing about which you wish to speak. As soon as you begin to write, you become aware of just how much you have mastered the topic you are writing about. Okay? So you can see just how important it is to allow space in learning programs, not only, especially for speaking and writing. Anyway, so let's get back. So, in a sense, the CLIL acronym, Content and Language Integrated Learning, is not actually saying something new, because this natural process of developing your language competence as you're getting to grips with the world around you, trying to make sense out of the world around you, is a natural process. So why call foreign language medium programs, why denominate or want to denominate foreign language medium programs with this acronym? And indeed, if you do denominate a foreign language medium program with the acronym CLIL, you are actually saying that content and language will be learnt in an integrated manner. But it's obvious that when you're learning through a foreign language, it is going to be different than when you learn through your mother tongue, which is normally associated with the normal school language. But of course, we know that today that is not really very much the case. But let's take it as being true for the moment. Anyway, why call it CLIL? Well, CLIL points our attention to the need to support this integrated learning on the realization that it may not happen easily, okay? So CLIL points out to us that there are two objectives: content learning and language learning. And the one is learnt through the other. Notice also that the acronym does not talk about teaching. It talks about learning. It's the process of learning here which should grasp our attention. So CLIL highlights doing two learning objectives, and this has obviously an impact on learning and on the learner. The learner has to learn the content, but he's being taught the content, and he has to learn the language, but he's not being taught the language, at least by the teacher. I'm referring here to the Italian situation, at least by the teacher who is carrying out the CLIL program, who is a non-language specialist teacher. Okay? Given the CLIL dual objectives, we need you need to you as a teacher, okay, you need to have what is being called language sensitive awareness. The subject teacher, the subject normally qualified as a non-language subject, but of course subjects are eminently linguistic as well, but they don't have primarily linguistic objectives. The subject teacher needs to have and to acquire an awareness of the language issues. And the subject teacher normally is not aware of these issues because he hasn't received any training on these issues, normally speaking. He needs also to be able to take language-enhanced action. He's aware of the issues, the problems, the difficulties, and he takes action on this. In other words, it might mean that he will need to incorporate into his, into his teaching, sorry, I've got a bit of a problem here with the clock. Into his teaching to allow the students to be able to do their work as well as possible. So this has an impact on the teaching and on the teacher. Okay. Sorry about that interruption. Now then, let's get to comprehension. One can easily imagine how the foreign language will represent an obstacle to the learning of the subject matter, okay? And therefore, one of the first things that will spring to your mind, you as teachers, will be, how are the students going to be able to understand me? How are the students going to be able to understand the materials that I want to give him? And obviously, your preoccupation is legitimate, because if the student can't understand, he can't access the content to be learnt, and therefore content objectives, learning outcomes will be put into jeopardy. So access to content is important, and therefore the issue of comprehensibility is highly important. It's important for learning the content. We've seen that the foreign language must be learnt, but it's not taught. Why is comprehension important for the learning of the foreign language? Well, we have here very important indications of a theoretical nature from work by Krashen. He works in the field of second language acquisition, and he highlighted how important it was for language to be acquired that the input that the learner is exposed to is comprehensible. If it's comprehensible and there's a lot of input being given to the individual, then the individual will be able to begin to acquire that language. So we can see how comprehension in a CLIL environment becomes extremely important. It's important for learning the content, and it's important for promoting the learning of the language. So what you need to ask yourselves at this point is, what methodological strategies and techniques need I adopt to support comprehension? In other words, when your students read, or when they have to listen. Now, normally, this is an issue, or this is a problem that, at least from our experience working with the teachers, that a subject teacher doesn't normally pose himself. He takes it as given that his students will understand the language that he's using, and in most cases that is probably the case, even though now today we have non-mother tongue, non-native speakers of the normal school language in the schools, which would therefore make us understand that we can't take this as make this a general rule, and therefore, not seeing it as a problem, no action is taken to solve the problem, or to sort of try and help the students to actually comprehend. Of course, one has to understand that understanding subject matter is not an issue only when we're talking about language, in this case a foreign language. The students may not understand because they don't have the prerequisites in terms of subject matter knowledge to be able to understand it. But anyway, here we're taking a language point of view. So the issue is here, what strategies could one take to help the students to be able to understand? One of the first things that comes to mind to your minds will be the difficulty, the language difficulty, the linguistic difficulty of the materials that you give them, of your oral input. Now, the students, in effect, might actually have quite some difficulty there. So one has to take steps to be able to eliminate or reduce this difficulty. You will need to manage your oral output, because what is your oral output is input to them. And you can do that by speaking more slowly, which as non-native speakers you will probably do in the first place, to choose your words carefully, to repeat, to reformulate, to make examples, to check comprehension, and get the students to ask questions. In other words, to encourage interaction during the lessons, to use non-verbal strategies like gesture, but also a very competent use of the tone of the voice, the loudness of the voice, the cadence of the voice, using the these extra linguistic aspects to capture the attention of your students. If it's written language, you can intervene by highlighting keywords. You can put them in, especially if the language is if the texts have been taken down from the internet. You can actually create paragraphs, put in titles, or get the students to put in the titles. Highlight keywords, or get the students to highlight the keywords or key expressions. In other words, get the students to work interactively on the written material as well. There is also a methodological dimension connected with comprehension, and this is very much used by language teachers, but far less used by subject teachers. And it is the use of pre-reading and pre-listening activities, while reading, while listening activities, and post-reading or post-listening activities. The pre-reading or the pre-listening activities have the function of preparing the students for what they will hear or what they will read. It helps them to create expectations about what they're going to read or listen to, and this will give them a reason, therefore, when they listen and when they read. And it also allows the teacher to be able to introduce new words that they might come up across, and also to awaken knowledge that they already possess. And that knowledge is what they need to be able to understand what they're going to listen to or what they're going to read. So the pre-listening or pre-reading is a very important step. The while listening or while reading is normally not, let's say, not undertaken. It's a very important part of comprehension, because whereas in the post-reading you ascertain comprehension, you ask them questions about what they've understood. It's after that they've read or after that they've listened. Whereas in the while listening or while reading activities, you guide the students as they listen or as they read. If you're trying to, this is what we've seen in our training programs. A teacher might show a video recording from YouTube. It could be a video recording of 12 minutes. And the students, without any preparation prior to the viewing of the video, they sit through the video for 12 minutes. And then questions are asked afterwards. What is required for a very useful outcome of viewing the video is that they have the preparation beforehand, and that the video be interrupted after a few minutes to guide, to orient the attention of the students, what they've heard, what they've understood, and then to project them ahead to what they're going to see later. So you're aiding comprehension of a video by sectioning the video into pieces. There's software that allows you to do that, but and it's far more efficacious than just getting the students to listen to the video or view the video and then ask the questions afterwards. Another useful thing to do to help the students to understand, help them in their understanding, is to map out the lesson. Just tell them, in this lesson we're going to be doing first this, then that, and then this. And for these reasons, this is the main reason for this, this is the main reason for that. And this again helps the student to have, let's say, he knows where he is, and he will feel less lost despite the difficulties that they might have in understanding. You also need to have an awareness and understanding of what genres they will have to read. Are they going to be reading only textbooks? Will they be reading authentic material? Will they be reading scientific articles? In other words, what genres or text types are they? Argumentative text, descriptive text, expositive text, etc. So these are things that are not normally the professional baggage of a non-language subject teacher. Production. We've seen before how important comprehension is from the point of view of content and from the point of view of language development. Oral production. Remember we just mentioned before about the quotes from Swain. Speaking and writing complete thought. Speaking and writing are essential. Now, every teacher, every language teacher knows just how difficult it is to get students to actually use the language, the foreign language in their lessons. In the CLIL situations, it might also be the case, but it has to be said, however, that in the CLIL situation, the students have a real reason for writing and for speaking. The reason is that they are learning a non-language subject. But anyway, getting back to the comprehensible output, as you can see here, we have comprehensible output, which is, let's say, counterposed. It counterposes comprehensible input. Swain says comprehensible input, okay, not bad, but it's not enough. You need comprehensible output. In other words, for an individual to learn a language, to build up his competence, he needs to be able to produce language. He needs to be able to speak. He needs to be able to write. But not just speak in any way. He needs to be able to speak comprehensively. And that means making appropriate and correct use of grammatical resources. And we'll be talking about that in a minute. So in a CLIL situation, the students will speak to learn the content and will write to learn the content. They communicate and create and articulate meanings through the language. And this allows them to consolidate their mastery of the content. Because until you begin to speak, you're not aware of just how well you know the content. And by speaking about it, you are actually weaving yourself around the content in order to be able to understand it and to process it in depth. And as you do that in language, what happens is also that you focus your attention on language. You're aware, because you are forcing yourself to express yourself, and you're using language as a means to be able to do that. And according to Swain, this is called languaging. I'll show you some examples in a minute. But anyway, speaking and writing to learn the content. Think about your lessons when you teach at school. Just how much space is there in the lessons in order for your students to be able to speak? And I'm not talking about what in the Italian system would be interrogazione. An interrogazione is to find out what the students know. It's not an occasion where the student speaks in order to learn. In an interrogazione, the student speaks to show what he has learned. Okay, so it's quite different. So to find out exactly what space there is for speaking and for writing, and what strategies you can adopt in order to, and techniques in order to be able to provide space, what activities, types of activities, in order to be able to allow them to be able to speak and to write. But apart from speaking and writing to learn the content, we also want them to speak and write to learn the foreign language. Because according to Swain, in order to be able to learn the language, it's not enough to be able to understand it. You need to be able to speak it. It's like sort of playing the piano. Just by listening to the piano or even seeing someone play it, you don't end up being able to play it. You have to begin to play it yourself. And it's the same with language. You have to begin to use the language in order to be able to build up your competence in that language, to have the competence, the system consolidated. When you actually produce the foreign language, you enter into syntactic mode. For example, I can understand Catalan. I know what my interlocutors are talking about, and I jump from word to word, and I sort of build up a map of what's being said. But I have no idea of anything grammatical of that language. I just use the words for the meanings, because they seem to have meanings which are similar to the Italian words, to French words, to Venetian words, or they're Romance or based in Latin. Now, when I would not be able to speak or write in Catalan because I have no morphosyntactic knowledge of that language. So you need, so that just shows you that comprehension is not enough. In order to be able to build up your production, you need to be able to produce, okay? And speaking and writing allows you to do that. As soon as you begin to put your pen to paper, you're saying, oh, I want to express the past perfect. How do you do that? I don't know how to do it. You immediately realize that you don't know how to do it. So you understand, you have realized you don't know how to do it. It's not the teacher telling you, it's you. And as soon as you notice this, you notice the gap between what you need to express and that you don't have what you need to express. And that is the first step in the process of beginning to acquire that fact of language that you have realized that you don't know. And of course, you have automatization. The more you speak, the better you get at speaking. It's like playing the piano. The more you play the piano, the better you get at playing the piano, obviously. You notice aspects of the language, but also, I mentioned here the cognitive academic language proficiency. I'll just skip that for the moment because I'm going to mention it a little later. So, they need to learn the foreign language. What strategies, what activities, what tasks can my students do in order for them to be able to speak and to write? Languaging. Languaging is a concept that Swain has introduced, and I'll show you some examples of students working in a science class. She says it is precisely when language is used to mediate problem solutions, whether the problem is about which word to use, or how best to structure a sentence so it means what you want it to mean, or how to explain the results of an experiment, that languaging occurs. So languaging is a form of exploration. It's using the language in order to be able to find the best way to express what you want to express. And here we have two students doing exactly that. Language focus. This is languaging, and it's a focus on form. These are two students in Italian school talking about they're having to write up a report to their teacher, and they've just carried out an experiment. I don't know about with petrol. And student 2, they had digital recorders around their necks, and we captured this little group work. Student 1, student 2 student 1 had the digital recorder, and student 1 and student 3 didn't, but we captured their words. Student 2 says, "Allora, don't move." He's referring to petrol. Student 1 says, "Doesn't move. Doesn't move. È lui che muove. It's he that moves. E doesn't, non è tu. E doesn't." He's explaining here a grammatical concept. As it's the third person, him, he, or she, he says he, then you can't put don't, you have to say doesn't. And then timidly, at least we could hear that from the recording, student 3 says, or has moved. In other words, he's saying, why don't we try the present perfect to express what we want to express? That's one example. And here we have, again, this same group of students. This student 2 says, the water molecule, he's writing it down on the report, the water molecule has give the electron to, which is basically incomprehensible to me, but anyway, student 1 who's following closely obviously understands, and he says, it gave, not has give, it gave, can have il verbo give, ti metti gave, that is Venetian, ti metti gave, si scrive gave, and he pronounced it in the Italian fashion, gave, okay? So here again, we have this working together on the language to find the best way to express content meaning. And according to Swain, this doesn't happen when the students work on their own. It happens when they work together. And then we have another example of a student commenting on language. Perdere is miss, cedere in the sense of to give. Okay, so here we have real examples. For production, what do you need to keep in mind? Well, activities and tasks that allow for interaction, that allow for note-taking. Get the students to do presentations. Get them to write reports and summaries. Get them to discuss. And here I would, this may normally take place in your lessons, but you have to keep in mind that even if they do normally take place in your lessons, because your teaching style accommodates for this, but you have to keep in mind that this is taking place through a foreign language, and therefore you need to give special support to the students to allow them to be able to carry out these activities in the foreign language. And that's where training, methodological training for subject teachers needs to focus upon. I'd like to draw your attention to this distinction here, presentational talk and exploratory talk. I mentioned here about one of the activities that students can do is presentations. And this is something I think that language teachers get their students to do, and also probably subject teachers do. Obviously, it's a more difficult process in the foreign language. But there is a distinction, because in presentational talk, students present thought which already exists. They have already thought out their thoughts. They have written them down in the form of slides or in a handout, and they present those thoughts. The form of talk, the quality of the language that you hear in this situation is more complete, not so much hesitant, but grammatically clean, because there has been a certain degree of preparation. But in exploratory talk, the language that you hear is completely different. When you allow space for your students to talk in order to learn, the language that you hear will not be presentational talk language, it will be exploratory talk language. The students have not yet mastered the topic. Their knowledge of the topic is tentative. They're talking about it to begin to get into it. They're talking about it in order to be able to see to what extent they've grasped the concepts, the meanings. Their talk is tentative. Their talk will be hesitant. Their talk will be fragmented. It'll be stopping and starting, hiccuping all along the way. But that is the nature of thinking. When you haven't got your thoughts in order, when you haven't got your understanding in place. So don't be alarmed if you see the characteristics of language, of exploratory talk, because it is natural that talk will be like that when they're trying to understand. Presentational talk is when they have already understood, and they're just telling us what they have understood. Okay, now then, the problems with oral. Now, getting the students to speak, as I've already said, and that you probably already know, is that they don't speak. And very often it's because of the type of questions asked by the teacher, the management of the activities, which are not clear, they don't have enough support or enough help, the clarity of the instructions, and the difficulty of the students to respond in real time. It's not their mother tongue, it's a foreign language. So these aspects have to be taken into consideration. Now here we have the results of 11 students in 5 different schools, and overall these 11 students in 5 different lessons in 5 different schools produced overall 1,353 words in lessons of an hour, and the average length of their utterances was 4.1 words. And you will say, well, that's not very much. Well, no, it isn't. It's not very much at all. I'll just show you a little bit more detail. Here we have the data. This was data collected during a research project. And here we have this sort of the didactic organization. Here we have lessons which were sort of teacher-driven. And here we have lessons which were group-driven. And we collected up data on the type, on the language which was being produced by the students. Here we wanted to find out the average length of the utterance. Every time they spoke, how long was the utterance when they spoke? Well, in the teacher-driven lessons, these 1, 2, 3, 4 students produced 101 words overall, and the average length of their utterance was 2 words, which makes one think that perhaps the teacher was asking questions like, do you understand? And the students would say, yes. Do you think Tom did this? And they would say, yes, I do, or no, I don't. But anyway, the average utterance length of 2.1 words is very, very small indeed. In the group work, as you can see, we have a different situation. Let's look at the number of words. At the bottom in red, overall, 1, 2, 3, 4 students produced 706 words. And the average length of their utterances is 5 words compared to the 2 words in the teacher-driven teaching organization. Okay, so you can see that the group type of activities allow the students to produce more language, which is a good thing. But look here at the blue words here. This student 2-1, produces 329 words. He is the most loquacious student, but the length of his utterances is only, let's say, it's 3.5 words. Whereas underneath him, student 4-1 produces 156 words, less than half, but his utterances are longer. His utterances seem to imply that he's giving information. His utterances needed to convey utterances, whereas the student 2-1, his utterances are probably more of an interactive type than of an informational type. Okay, so that just shows you how we see here how important it is to be able to speak and to write for learning and for the foreign language, but in reality, it's extremely difficult to get that underway in the classroom. I think training needs to be done on this to help teachers to set in place activities that allow for this. And of course, if the teachers are able to work in team, the subject teacher and the language teacher, then this kind of training or this kind of the new learning that the teacher needs can be done together, and the students learn how to do it together. The students with the language teacher then can take out of the classroom of what they've learnt to do, speaking-wise, writing-wise, with the language teacher, and use it to learn with the subject teacher. The problems with writing, what we have noted in writing activities which teachers propose, we've seen this in their papers that they produce for us, is there is a very, very limited variety of writing activities. Students in the non-language subjects don't actually write very much. And what they do write here, the length of the written production, is very small. They might have to put a word into an empty space on a planisphere. They might have to complete a sentence. They might have to write a definition, which is probably the only type of genre that we found that they were asked to write. But anyway, it may not be the case always. But I think what needs to be kept in mind is the types of activities, the variety of activities, and keep an eye on the length of the written production of the students. The students are not going to learn to write if all that they are being asked to write is to slot in a word or to complete a sentence. Okay? So that needs to be kept in mind. Now then, another aspect that I wanted to focus attention on is the issue of aims, objectives. It's a very delicate and difficult aspect of the whole CLIL process, in my view, also because it's still hasn't been, let's say, there's innovation going on, and subject teachers are being helped to decline their objectives in terms of abilities or skills and competencies. And this is not underway even yet, even in the normal school curriculum, where Italian is the language, is the medium of instruction. So the subject teachers still have to learn how to do this even in their normal curricular programming. Language teachers are very much favoured in this, because the work by the Council of Europe on levels of language A1, A2, B1, B2, etc., have actually helped, and the work on competencies and descriptors has helped the language teacher to be able to move ahead. But it's not the case with subject teachers. But anyway, the subject teachers need help in defining their objectives. The questions that they ask themselves is, it is their worries, the objectives can't be the same. We've got to lower them. And they seem to think that this is, let's say, a betrayal to their subject to have to lower the level of the objectives. But then again, one should ask oneself, should it be the case? Is it necessary that the subject objectives be lowered? Maybe it's not the subject, the objectives that need to be lowered, but the methodology needs to change to allow for the subject objectives to be more easily reached. So the issues that have come out, at least with the teachers we've been working with, is that they need to be declined in a different manner. And indeed, as soon as a subject teacher begins to work in a CLIL mind frame, the issue of he faces the issue of objectives and begins to understand that he has to decline them differently. Also because now, in the midst of all of it, there is language. And normally, language would not be on the agenda when he declines his subject aims. What is needed is that the subject-specific aims be guaranteed, that the cognitive dimension be guaranteed, and that's connected with the skills aspect and the competence aspect, and I'll bring that out later. And what you need to keep in mind, the language dimension, because CLIL has dual objectives. Because CLIL says content and language integrated learning. So how do you ascertain if language has been learnt if you don't incorporate some kind of attention to language in your objectives? And if you incorporate attention to language in your objectives, then you're obviously going to be able, you will want to see whether there are the outcomes. Okay. Now then, let's look at the language. Okay. The aspects that you might want to consider. The specific language characteristics of the subject. Now, this is something that the foreign language teacher would do. If a foreign language teacher were working in an Istituto Tecnico, for example, then her language lessons might incorporate the specific language, la microlingua, of one of the subjects being taught and being learned by the students. For example, the use of the passive without the agent in science, the types of genres in science, writing a report of an experiment, which is what those students were doing when you saw the examples of languaging. The text types, what type of texts will they need to read? Read? What types of texts will they need to write? In our research, we haven't seen examples of students being asked to write anything except reports in science experiments. Okay, so for in history, we haven't seen any particular types of text types that they have to write. Keep in mind language skills. What language skills will you want to promote through your CLIL programs? Speaking, we've seen that speaking is important. Writing, we've seen that writing is important for the language and for the content. Listening is important for the content and for the language. Reading is important for the content and for the language. So we need to keep on board the attention to the language skills and see what kind of outcomes might be possible. And of course, keep in mind that there might be some cognitive linguistic forms that you want to pay attention to because they are related to the aims of the subject and to the learning task. For example, you want the students to learn, they will be required to infer from an experiment. What language will they need for that? I think, blah, 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 because, blah, blah, blah. It is due to, blah, 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 it is the result of, blah, 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 because of, blah, blah, blah. In other words, we want them to acquire the language for inferring. We want them to predict, if we do this and we do that, what will come about as a result? So the language might be, so probably, it is probable that, it ought to, the student, it should, it may be. There are just so many cognitive linguistic forms that the student, in order to be able to learn your subject matter, will need to be able to use them. And by using them, he will learn them. But it's a good idea that you know what the cognitive linguistic forms are. And you might get your language teacher colleague, to be able to broach them, to be able to teach them, so that your students, when they come to you, are able to know them already and can use them to grapple with the subject matter. Here's an example. This is a real example, which I actually translated because it was in Italian. It's an example of language-enhanced aims. And I put in red what, I hope it is visible for you, I put in red reference. The reference is made to language. So here we have it, it's art. The students must be able to recognize and define orally the characteristics of a Gothic building, materials, functions, historical, geographical, and cultural aspects. Be able to write short, descriptive, informative texts on the basic characteristics of the Gothic period. Be able to interact orally through the presentation of short reports on the genre, and also the descriptive informative texts were genres, on the topics dealt with, justifying one's choices and opinions. Be able to describe pictures, slides, or short videos using the appropriate technical language. Be able to understand oral messages on technical topics linked to Gothic architecture. Now then, from this, from the work that I extracted it from, is obviously not what the teacher normally does. These references to the language have been put in because it's part of the CLIL idea that you need to take care of the development of the language through the content and the content through the language. And of course, if you put these in as objectives, you need to look at them at the end of the course as outcomes, okay? And in the middle, you have to make the methodological decisions to make sure that you are allowing for these objectives to be reached. So you can see just how CLIL really does impact on the way you think about your objectives, and therefore the way you think about your teaching and the way you're going to be getting your learners, your students to learn, and also, in the end, how you're going to verify that testing and assessment is not going to be broached by me. I mentioned before the cognitive dimension of CLIL. Why is that important? Now, because as you saw, I'll take you back to this slide here. Oh, sorry, there it was. This language here. These are cognitive linguistic forms. This is language used to learn. Inferring, predicting, speculating, associating, comparing. These are all things that the students need to do when they're learning your subject. And when they do these things in the foreign language to learn your subject, they are developing a competence which has been called cognitive academic language competence. In other words, it's a type of language competence which develops as a result of using language, or being in contact with language, which is on academic material, which has a cognitive challenge to it, and that requires cognitive activities on it. in order for it to be learned. Now then, cognitive academic language develops as a result of learning through the language, learning in the language. And if, consider it, when you receive your students, imagine that you teach in the primo biennio, and the students come to your classes from the scuola media. It's quite obvious to you that those students have a competence in Italian, I'm talking here about Italian, a competence, or the normal language of the school, a competence which is very general. It's the type of competence that they use, their kids with their friends or their family, nothing terribly sophisticated about it. Now, you would expect those same students at the end of the 5 years of the Scuola Superiore to have developed linguistically. In other words, you would not expect them to speak the way they spoke when they first entered the Scuola Superiore. In other words, going through all those years, learning all those subjects, learning it all through Italian, they develop a sophisticated competence in Italian. So much so that when you actually do, when you do your interrogazioni, when you do your final tests, you expect competence in the language. And if you don't get competence in the language, you actually can't evaluate them because they're not able to express their competence because they don't have the language to do so. So without you realizing it, you are actually, even when you speak through the normal language of the school, which is the normal language of the students, pretend it is, you are actually taking them through the steps of acquiring ever more a more sophisticated and appropriate language competence for schooling, or what you expect at school. And one could call this the cognitive academic language competence. This is the kind of competence I think that the ministry would expect to come out of CLIL experiences. Otherwise, why go to all this effort? Why, at least with reference to Italy, why oblige schools to do CLIL in a school subject in the final year at school? Obviously, it cannot only be done then, it has to be done beforehand in order for the teachers to get used to it and for the students to get used to it. But anyway, this is a decision that must have been made on the basis of some conviction that out of a CLIL experience, the language, because this must have been done for reasons connected with language, with foreign language competence, the students are going to come out of a CLIL experience with a better foreign language competence. And the reason why the ministry uses the word CLIL associated with this form of teaching and learning is because they want it to be guaranteed. Rather than just saying, these are foreign language medium situations, foreign language medium teaching situations, foreign language medium learning situations, which just refers to the medium, okay? They prefer to use the word CLIL, which let's say, openly calls our attention to something that needs to be guaranteed. Otherwise, what's the point of doing it? In other words, content must be learned through the language, and here we've got problems because it's a foreign language, and the foreign language must be learned through the content. Okay, so that has to be guaranteed. Otherwise, it's all a waste of time. Okay, but we are seeing that it can be done. There's a huge amount of work to be done, but we are seeing how the methodological changes that a subject teacher undergoes as a result of training and also being made aware of many things and being helped to do many things, it's now seeping backwards into normal school curriculum. In other words, into courses which are not delivered through a foreign language, but which are being delivered anyway in the normal school language. And as I said at the beginning, you can't now take for granted that in your classes you only have mother tongue speakers, because you don't. You have non-mother tongue speakers. So if you think about it, the CLIL message is ideal for all course situations. It is indeed, it captures what Vygotsky and Halliday say, but which very often doesn't happen. If we think back to the 70s, in Great Britain, a movement began which was called the LAC movement, LAC, Language Across the Curriculum. In other words, language across the curriculum grew up as a movement as a result of the alarming results of a ministerial report that highlighted the huge, let's say, the unacceptable proportions of illiteracy in the general public. Illiteracy of young people who left school not competent in the national language, who never read and never wrote after school, who even at school read badly and wrote badly. So LAC, language across the curriculum, is basically CLIL, only it refers to the normal school language. Language across the curriculum says we cannot go on just shouldering the insegnanti di lettere with the job of developing competency in the national language. The whole job has to be shouldered by everybody. Every single teacher in the school has to shoulder this job. Otherwise, we're not going to get around the problem. So, every teacher, being a teacher, was to shoulder the problem of promoting competency in the national language. So the geography teacher, through his lessons, had to promote language competence. The science teacher, the math teacher, the art teacher, everybody. CLIL is doing the same. And by seeping backwards, it's introducing a sort of a lack element into the normal school curriculum. But anyway, that's about the future. But we need this competence. But what have we found? What have we found? And I've nearly come to the end of my talk. The cognitive dimension in the aims is lacking. We took all the papers that our coursisti, our course followers, wrote at the end of their courses, and we decided to look at the activities that they proposed and the aims that they proposed. And we compared what they were doing with the cognitive processes by Bloom's taxonomy. But anyway, here we have just a very brief explanation. We have lower order cognitive processes and higher order cognitive processes. What did we see? Well, I just mentioned to you the lower orders, cognitive processes according to Bloom are when you remember something, understanding and applying. Higher order are analyzing, evaluating, and creating something new. Okay. What did we find in our papers, in the teaching units that our teachers provided us? The students were asked, and the objectives were to remember facts. You give them a text to read. You find out what they remember after by asking them questions. They had to remember principles. And they had to remember procedures. How do you calculate blah, blah, blah? They will remember how to calculate, okay? And then understand, not just remembering facts, but understanding the principles behind in a text that they have read, okay? They would be asked to understand it, okay? And that was it. Basically, the work that the students were being asked to do was to read or listen or see a video, remember the facts afterwards, and then to talk about what they've understood of that text, or the video, or whatever. And that was it. No other. The learning cycle stopped. It didn't proceed. So the students were only doing lower order thinking skills. They weren't taken over to be employed in undergoing or doing in language, in the foreign language, higher order thinking skills. But of course, we need that. We need them to carry out higher order thinking skills in the foreign language in order for them to reach CALP. They need to be able to reach the CALP. So here we actually do have an issue. It's a training issue. Because it's an issue concerning objectives which were declined only in terms of content. The students will know. The students will understand. So here we have a problem with the objectives. The objectives did not decline the skills and the competencies. And also the activities didn't require the students to do anything other than remember and to understand. It may have been the case that the teachers who are following who follow our courses are overly concerned with the fact that the texts that they give them are in a foreign language, and that therefore the major part of the work is to ensure that they understand what is in the text. Okay, so basically speaking, talking about the content, the major issue here for the subject teachers is to give them less content, or bring in new content. For example, why not? If you're teaching history and you normally teach, the outbreak of the Second World War, if you're doing CLIL through German, why not treat the outbreak of the Second World War through a German lens, for example? So therefore, ensuring a cultural dimension as well. So these are all the things that we have seen that crop up in our methodology courses, that the teachers ask about and want to know more about. Okay, so that was the final slide, and thank you again for having followed me, and please do have a nice weekend. But if you want to ask a few questions, please do. Oh, very nice.
Thank you, Carmel. Thank you.
You've been very patient with me, and as I said, I've just given a few points. But if training continues, I think you really got
wonderful.
Yes,
you gave us really useful hints, important. You addressed very important issues, and I'm sure our teachers today will have the time to go in deeper and just well. So thank you very much for finding the time to speaking with Techno CLIL. I'm really grateful that you are. How easy you are, and really you take pleasure in Saturday afternoon. Thank you very much. So you can participate in our YouTube channel.
Okay, have a nice evening.
So you have the opportunity to watch the webinar. Thank you again, Carmel. Bye-bye.